Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a bunch of wild edible plants that grow in Southeast Mass today. And I thought for the sake of making this talk a little bit more relevant than if I started in the spring and talked about stuff that's out of season right now, that it more or less jump right into where we are in the current growing season and talk about stuff that's available right now and then go from midsummer onward. And I still think I have so much to talk about that I will fill the entire allocated time for me without even having to get to the spring or the early summer stuff. So that's my plan tonight. Now, of all the things I'm going to talk about, I'm going to include a mix of native species and non-native species, and the non-native species include weeds and invasive species. So depending upon what you're interested in gathering, there's you need to be more or less concerned about possible environmental impacts from picking it. So when native species are involved, I do encourage people to use some forbearance and restraint when gathering those from the wild, because native plants often have important roles in the ecosystem. Animals rely upon them for food or some other important portion of their life cycle. So I encourage people to bear that in mind. But also recall, though, that depending upon the part of the plant you're harvesting, there are going to be different impacts. For example, berry picking and nut gathering, those are relatively benign foraging activities because all you're doing is picking the seed dispersal portion of the organism. And there's often a lot of those around. If you gather some, it's not really that big a deal. But if you are digging plants up to harvest them or stripping all the flowers, all the leaves off plants to harvest them, you can imagine that could be a lot more traumatic for the plant. So that's with native species. And then at the other end of the ecological spectrum, we have the edible weeds and the edible invasive species. So see if I can get this to work here. All right, so here is a book that came out a dozen years ago that was put out by the agency I used to work for with a couple other partners. And it's intended to educate people about invasive plants. And invasive plants are ecologically disruptive, and the main way they are is they usurp the habitat of the native species. They take it away from them. So the ecologists don't like these plants at all, and they're trying to get the word out, so they put out guidebooks like this to let people know about invasive plants. But if there is a silver lining to the invasive cloud, perhaps it's the fact that some of the invasive species in this book are edible. So out of the 66 species covered in this book, at least 20 of them are edible. And as far as at least most ecologists are concerned, they'd be thrilled if we all picked and ate as many of these as we possibly could, provided that we don't spread them around in the process. So I'm very serious about this. They are guilt-free foraging opportunities. So you can't pick too many invasive species in terms of ecology. So there's a bunch that grow in Southeast Mass, and the two I will be talking about tonight are autumn olive and wineberry. So when those come up in the show, you will hear more about them. All right, so now I'm going to spend the rest of the show talking about specific species, what they are, what you do with them, what they taste like, and all that good stuff. All right, so this species has a really long season availability. It's available like this from May through November, and it's a very ubiquitous plant. I encountered this plant on at least 80% of all the wild edible walks I do. It's that common. It's probably the most common weed in greenhouses, very common in vegetable gardens, farms. So it is called wood sorrel or sour grass. And it has these yellow 5-petal flowers and then leaflets. So this whole thing is a leaf, and it comes into 3 leaflets, and you see how distinctively heart-shaped the leaflets are. So that's one way to tell it apart from clover. Also, these flowers, which don't look like clover flowers at all, would be another way to tell. But you can tell just from the leaflets. Now, clover leaves are technically edible, but you really need multiple stomachs to digest them properly. So I don't usually teach that one to people. But this one I happily teach to people. The whole plant is tart. So any tender part of the plant you can eat. So these leaves, the flowers, these guys right here are the seed capsules, and they're tart and juicy too, so you can eat them too. So now, the chemical responsible for the sour flavor in this plant is a chemical called oxalic acid, which might not be good for you if you ate it in huge amounts, like an enormous salad bowl full of just this plant. If you ate that much, It could inhibit your body's ability to uptake calcium, and it could irritate your stomach lining, but there's no reason to be unduly concerned about the chemical because it's present in a lot of conventional vegetables like beets and spinach and rhubarb. So as long as you're eating in moderation with other foods, it's perfectly fine. So this one is good raw, it's a good salad ingredient. And so is this one. So these are actually two different species that look very closely alike. This one is called poor man's pepper. This one is called peppergrass. They taste the exact same. They're closely related. So if you messed up and pick one instead of the other, there's absolutely no harm whatsoever. So this one on the left, like the wood sorrel, has a very long season of availability. And it's these flat, round seed pods that you can see right here. That's the main edible part of the plant. You can eat other parts too, but that's the part I recommend eating. And if you just pick a few and just chew them for a few seconds, you'll see why this plant is called peppergrass, because it's got a kick to it, very similar to watercress, because watercress is actually a cousin of peppergrass. So it's that same sharp flavor that this plant has. So, so this is a very commonly found plant in any place that's not mowed. You'll see it. Even, I mean, I've got it in my lawn where it's managed to evolve into a form that it goes to seed at 2 inches in height, so it still is reproducing even though it's getting mowed. Usually though, it's about 1.5 feet tall. So this is a great plant to remember if you have company coming over for supper, and I know we're not doing that right now, but when we can again, and you invite them over and the roast, whatever you're cooking for them isn't done yet, or they're just starving, you need to feed them something, is you can go out your yard, find some of these peppergrass seed pods, strip them off, and mix them with a little cream cheese and put that as a spread on some crackers and feed that to them, and your guests will love it, and they'll forget all about the fact that dinner isn't ready yet. So that's one thing to remember. Now, I'll tell you a quick story about how a number of years ago, I was on Monomoy Island out in Cape Cod on a natural history program that was being led by somebody else, and she had planned to serve these roast beef and boursin sandwiches for lunch. And just outside of the building where these sandwiches are being assembled was a whole bunch of peppergrass. So I asked the leader of the group, can we add the peppergrass seed pods to these sandwiches? And she said, sure. So we did, and they were very good that way. All right, so you might have seen this plant along the roadside. This is a close relative of dandelion called chicory. And these blue flowers are edible. They don't have much of a flavor, but blue is an unusual food color, so it's fun to just snip the petals off and add them to a salad just to get that color in there. Now, chicory leaves are edible too in the early spring or the late fall, not in the summer. They're way too bitter, but you can eat them in the spring or in the fall. And then probably the most well-known part of chicory as far as eating or actually drinking is the root. And this is described in my foraging book, but basically what you do is gather the roots, and probably the best time to do it is not in the summer, but in the fall, over the winter, anytime the ground isn't frozen. So pull up the roots and then slice them crosswise, and then just spread them out in a cookie sheet like I've done here, and then roast them slowly in an oven until they become brittle and aromatic, and then throw them into a food processor and grind them up, and then take those grounds and brew a beverage with them. And I find that I only need about half the amount of chicory grounds to brew the same strength beverage as coffee grounds. And whatever device you use to make coffee, you can use the same device for chicory. So whether you use a percolator or Mr. Coffee Maker or French press, whatever you do, you can use that same device for the chicory. And so you make a drink from the chicory grounds, and it's quite remarkable how similar the flavor is to coffee, especially if you drink your coffee with cream and sugar and you drink the chicory the same way. Flavor is very similar. The one big difference is chicory does not have caffeine in it. So if you're one of these people who says, what's the point of drinking it if there isn't any caffeine in it, then the chicory is just not going to cut it for you. All right, so when I make stuff from wild ingredients, I'm not a purist about it. So if I'm making a wild berry pie, for example, I don't have to use yak butter for the shortening. I can use regular butter, regular sugar, and the wild fruit makes it a wild pie. But it is fun to make your own salad completely from wild ingredients, which I've done here in the photo. But do not let me deter you from just throwing a few chicory flowers into regular salad. That's fine. You don't have to go extreme like I did. So So in this salad, I've got some wild mustard flowers. The purpley blue things are the chicory flowers. There's wood sorrel in here, and also lamb's quarters, and chickweed and other spring edibles in there, and fall edibles are in there. And then the red berries are partridge berries, and these orangey things are ground cherries. So this is what partridge berries look like, and these can be quite common in Southeast Mass, especially under pine trees. You see the pine needles here in the forest floor. Partridge berries have almost no flavor. So why eat them? Why use them? Because they're pretty. So I'll just pick a few and put them on top of a salad just to get that bright red color in there. And then the ground cherry is a very yummy wild tomato relative. And this is a summer into the fall foraging opportunity because just like garden tomato and eggplant type relatives, these plants don't really get cranking until the onset of hot weather. So you won't see the fruits until toward the end of the summer into the fall. And so the fruits develop in this little husk called a calyx. So the ripening fruit is in there. And as the fruit ripens, this thing turns yellow and then beige and then tan, and then it falls off the plant completely when the fruit is ripe. And so that's why this plant is called a ground cherry, because when you want to look for the right fruit, you don't actually look on the plant, you look underneath the plant where the fruit has already fallen off. Another key thing to remember is you cannot see that fruit unless you pull the husk off. So you see right here in the upper left-hand corner, the little yellow tomato-like fruit. So this is what, we can only see this fruit because the husk has been pulled off the outside. So if you are seeing a tomato-like plant with yellow fruit on it without having to pull any husks off, it is not the edible ground cherry. It's probably the poisonous horse nettle. And if you look carefully, you'll see some thorns on that plant. They share a similar habitat, so there is a possibility you might encounter that one while you're looking for ground cherry. But just remember, ground cherry always has a husk on it, and you'll be fine. And it does taste like a sweet cherry tomato, so they can be quite good. All right, jewelweed. So this is a plant I hope you all know. You may know about the reputed medicinal value of this plant. So jewelweed juice extracted from the plants has been clinically proven to cure poison ivy for some people. I'm apparently not one of those people. But anyway, it does work for some people. And what you do, and this time of year is a fine time to do it, find some nice, juicy, tall jewelweed plants, and just grab a few and scrunch them up and get the juice out of the plants, and then take that juice and apply it on your skin any place where you either have poison ivy, where you think you're exposed to poison ivy, or it's even possible that if you put it on your skin before you encounter poison ivy, it might reduce the likelihood that you get poison ivy. So that's pretty cool. So, and if you want that remedy available year-round, what you can do is gather up those plants and bring them home and throw them into a blender or throw them in a pot with some water and boil it up, and then take that liquid and pour it into ice cube trays and freeze it. And then you can put an ice cube on your skin. And some people claim that the jewelweed juice is good for all kinds of skin irritations, even athlete's foot. So that's great. All right, but there is an edible part to jewelweed, and it is the seeds enclosed in the ripe seed pod. So here's one right here. Here's one right here. The tricky part is when the seed pods are ripe, they detonate at the slightest touch. So that's why the plant is called touch me not, because if you brush against a ripe seed pod like this, it's going to explode on you. And so you won't be able to capture any seeds if that happens. So what you need to do is sneak up on a seed pod like this and grab it and have it explode in your hand. So there's a couple ways you can tell, by the way, that this seed pod is ripe. One way is you can actually see through the skin of the seed pod to the little dark things inside. Those are the ripe seeds. And also notice that the angle of the seed pod to the stem is 90 degrees. If it's bigger than that, like this one right here, that's more like 135 degrees, this seed pod would not be ripe yet. This one, much more like 90 degrees, this one is ripe. All right, so what you want to do is grab a seed pod like that, have it explode in your hand. Don't worry, it won't hurt. So that's what you want to look for, a seed pod like that, have it explode in your hand. Then it does this business. And then out will pop these letter D type things. Those are the ripe seeds. And if you eat them, they taste just like store-bought English walnuts. So they're teeny, they're about 1/8 of an inch long, but you know, the nibbling them is fun because you have that nice flavor. Another cool thing you can do with these ripe seeds, and you don't need to do this to eat them, but just to see, is if you gently rub the outer covering off, the inner color is this beautiful bright robin's egg blue color. And I have no idea why that plant produces that color in there, because as far as I know, no creatures ever see it. It's just one of those unexplained mysteries of Mother Nature. All right, so here's purslane, another great salad ingredient. And those of you that have a vegetable garden probably have this as a weed in your garden. And I would wager that this plant is healthier than some of the crops you're deliberately trying to grow, because this plant has got lots of iron and other minerals in it. It's loaded with omega-3 fatty acids. It's very good for you. So you can eat it fresh, you can eat it cooked. The stems, when they get big like this, you can pickle them. And I'm going to show you a way to use the purslane that requires no cooking skill whatsoever. Is you can throw the purslane leaves into a gazpacho, and you don't even have to make the gazpacho. You could go to the organic farm stand or the specialty produce store and just buy the pre-made gazpacho and then bring it home and just throw the purslane leaves in there. And the texture of the purslane leaves works really well in a gazpacho. All right, so black raspberry, these are probably pretty much done in southeastern Mass. It's more of a July fruit, but you might still be able to find a few of these. But I wanted to teach this one to you for future reference, because this is a really cool thing to know and to look for during the off season. So it could be December or February, and you're like walking your dog, or if there's snow, you're cross-country skiing, and you see these thorny purple canes. Those are black raspberries. And remember where they are, and then go back in late June, early July, and look for the ripe fruit. So that's, by the way, an indication that if you want to get serious about foraging, it's good to keep your observation skills turned on all the time, because sometimes the best time to find a wild edible does not coincide with the ripening time. And I will point that out again in a subsequent slide. All right, so here's a plant that if you don't know, you should know. This one, you find it as you get closer and closer to Buzzards Bay. So not so much further north in Southeast Mass, but as you get closer to Buzzards Bay, you may encounter this plant. This is called a wineberry, and this is actually an invasive species, so it's a guilt-free foraging opportunity. You don't have to worry about the ecological impacts of you picking all the fruit. Help yourself. And it's a gorgeous fruit. I would say that perhaps a regular red raspberry has a more interesting flavor, especially like if you try to cook with the wineberries, like to make a jam from them. I think a red raspberry jam is more interesting flavor. But wineberries are great for any application where you can enjoy the beauty of the fruit. So even as much as like just flinging a few on top of your breakfast cereal in the morning, it's really great. So, and by the way, you see these furriness on the twigs here. That's one of the ways to recognize wineberries when they're out of season. So that conditions there year round. So you know, there are big thorns here and here and here and here. Between the big thorns, it's almost a hairy furriness going on. So look for that, and then look for fruits like this. And by the way, another way to spot wineberries is when a fruit is pulled off, what is left is this bright kind of orangey yellow core left on the plant as the fruits fall off, as people pick them, as birds eat them, and so on. So that's another characteristic of the wineberry. And and one trick you can use with wineberries, and those of you probably, many of you already know this trick, if you want to freeze berries, is you just pick them and then spread them out on a cookie sheet and freeze them on the cookie sheet, and then put them into a plastic container to store them. And the wineberries hold up very well that way. And so this flan was made with frozen wineberries, and the flan was made like 5 months later. And look how well the wineberries still hold up in this recipe many months later. All right, so here's black cherry, one of our native wild cherries. And this one's quite common in southeastern Mass. And it varies in flavor from tree to tree. Sometimes they're puckery and astringent, not very good at all. And other times they can be quite sweet and just about as good as a regular cherry in flavor. but these are small. There's no getting around that. So black cherries will approach, but not quite get to a half an inch in diameter. And the pits inside each fruit aren't that much smaller than conventional cherry pits. So I wouldn't recommend utilizing black cherries for any recipe that require pitting each individual fruit, because that would be exceedingly tiresome. So what I tend to do, well, honestly, what I tend to do is just stuff my face right by the tree. But if you do have enough discipline to pick some cherries and bring them home, you can throw them in a saucepan with some water and simmer them for a while, and then put everything through a strainer or a sieve or a food mill, and then the pits are held back, and then the juice and the pulp goes through, and that's raw material you can use for making black cherry jam, jelly, cordials, fruit soup, stuff like that. All right. So here's the common elderberry, and this plant likes to grow in open, sunny, meadowy habitat. There's a good amount of that in southeastern Mass. So this is what it looks like in June when the plants are blooming. And some people will collect these flowers, and you can make a drink from them. And some people will fry these flowers in fritter batter. But I think black locust flowers, which I left out of the show because it's a May foraging opportunity, make much tastier fritters than these elderflowers. So I tend to just leave the elderflowers on the plant, and because every elderflower you pick, you won't get any fruit there. So I tend to leave these on the plant and then wait for the fruit to form. So I'm just going to skip, in the interest of making sure we have lots of time to get through the rest of the show, I'm just going to skip through the next few slides and just get to the fruit. Okay. So this is what ripe elderberry fruit looks like, and this photo is an upside down. This is what the berry clusters tend to do from the weight of the fruit, is hang upside down. And I understand that you can get a stomach ache from eating too many raw elderberries, but if you dry the fruit first or you cook the fruit first, you can eat all you want. And I like to mix elderberries and apples together. So like elderberry apple pie, elderberry apple sauce is more interesting than just plain apple pie or applesauce. All right, so bayberry is edible. You can use the bayberry leaves like bay leaves in cooking. They're actually not related. Bay leaves are actually related to sassafras and spicebush. This is in a separate botanical family, but the leaves have a similar flavor, so you can use them the same way. And while I'm at it, let me just mention the berries here. And bayberry plants come in male and female, so it's only the female plants that have the berries. And yes, there is a waxy coating on these berries. And yes, the colonists used that wax to make bayberry candles back during colonial days. But I've done this myself, but I've heard from many people, they strongly advise, do not rely on bayberry berries as your sole source of wax to make those candles, because it needs a huge amount of wax. And I think even what the colonists did is they probably used tallow or some other source for the main part of their wax, and then they would just add the waxy bayberries in there to get that wonderful scent. So that's the advice I give you if you try to make your own candles from bayberries. All right, so here's a related plant called sweet fern, and both bayberry and sweet fern have no trouble growing in the nutrient-poor soil because they can do what plants in the pea family can do. They can make the nitrogen fertilizer available to the plant through the symbiotic bacteria in their root nodules. So yeah, so this is one of the plants the colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era, and they were boycotting the British tea. They would just steep the leaves in hot water for a few minutes. And the seeds are edible too. There's not much to them, but you can nibble on them if you find them. This is a little bit earlier in the summer is when I would tend to expect to find them. Now here's a cool plant called sweet goldenrod, and this is one I'm propagating from seed in my nursery, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But we have many species of goldenrod, but this is the only one I know of that tastes good. And this is another of our native plants the American colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era. So the leaves and the flowers on the sweet goldenrod have a strong licorice flavor. So you can make a licorice flavored tea from a goldenrod. Isn't that cool? And this one, I've encountered in Plymouth. I've encountered it on the Cape. So it's definitely grows in southeastern Mass. Look for it in sunny, sandy or rocky areas is where you're most likely to find it. And yes, I've grown this plant from seed, and I found out how easy it was when I bought some plugs of sweet goldenrod from the New England Wildflower Society, and I potted them up, and they bloomed and they went to seed, and I had little baby sweet goldenrod plants popping up in the same pot, the same growing season that I potted up the plugs. that is an easy plant to grow. And so I grow sweet goldenrod from seed every year, and I'm planting it out in some of my projects. All right, so here's the spice bush I mentioned before. Another one of the revolutionary tea plants. The colonists would just steep the spice bush twigs in hot water for a few minutes, and that is one edible way to use the plant. And the leaves have a fragrance to them too, so you could try making tea from them too. But probably the main part that I eat the most on the plant are the berries. And they look like this in September. And so they're this bright red color. And these berries are approximately the same size and shape as a Tic Tac. And these berries are a savory spice. And so what I will do is gather them and then spread them out in a cookie sheet and just stick them, in my dining room, on my dining room table for several weeks. And the berries will lose that beautiful color and they turn this dull reddish brown color and get all wrinkly on you. But once they're dried out like this, you can store them in glass jars in your pantry and they'll keep for years without going bad. And as I said, I use these as a savory spice. So the flavor is like a cross between black pepper and Szechuan peppercorn. So they're good for soups, omelets, casseroles, stuff like that. All right, but I want to also mention, because I talked about how you have to show some forbearance and restraint in foraging native plants. So I would include spice bush on that list, especially when you're gathering spice bush berries, because it so happens that these berries are high in lipids, which are vegetable fats, and the songbirds know that. And so the songbirds seek out these berries to eat and to fatten up to fuel their southward migration. So if you are going to pick spice bush berries from the wild, it's important to leave lots of berries in the plant so the birds get all they need that way. But this is a good plant for growing in your yard, especially if you've got damp, shady conditions. And especially if you have a problem with deer, if they're, hammering your other foliage, this might be a good landscape choice because it's way, way down in the list of things that deer like to eat. They have to have pretty much gone through everything else before they'll get to the spice bush. And yes, only the female plants produce berries. So if you go to a nursery and you say, give me a female spice bush, good luck, because most nurseries don't know, because the plants have to reach a certain age in order to start blooming and be able to distinguish them male from female. And usually the nurseries aren't holding the plants that long. So my suggestion would be plant several and increase the chances are that you get spice bush. And to talk about ecological associations a little bit longer using this species, I can't stop talking about this species without talking about a really cool critter that hangs out on spicebush and on sassafras. It's the spicebush swallowtail butterfly caterpillar. So after the butterfly lays an egg and the egg hatches, the first instars, first stages of the caterpillar look exactly like bird poop. So that is a very clever disguise, so the birds don't eat it. Why would they want to eat poop? So that works. And then it quickly morphs into this form where these, what look like eyes are actually fake eye patches. The real eyes are down here. The caterpillar is trying to impersonate a snake to scare the birds away from eating it. So that works. And even at the pupa stage, look at what the caterpillar morphs into. It morphs into something that looks just like a dried leaf. So isn't it amazing that this organism has evolved all these ingenious disguises to avoid being eaten? Yes, so I have encountered these on my spicebush plants in my nursery. And I'll just tell you a secret. So while you're out walking the trails, practicing social distancing, of course, and you go past any sassafras or spicebush plants and you see a leaf that's rolled up on itself, very slowly and carefully tease that leaf apart and look inside. And relatively frequently, you'll find one of these caterpillars hiding in there. So that's a fun discovery while you're out in the woods. All right, so here's wintergreen, so also called teaberry or checkerberry. So this is a plant that should be familiar to most of you. And the entire plant, so the leaves and the berries have the wintergreen flavor. And you can make a sun tea from the leaves, especially this year's leaves, which are tender and kind of reddish green, make the best tea. And the berries do have a wintergreen flavor. They're not that sweet, but they do have the wintergreen flavor. But if I were going to make a wintergreen flavored tea, I actually make it from one or two trees. So either the yellow birch or the black birch, both of which I've seen in southeastern Mass. And they're not related to wintergreen at all. It's just a botanical coincidence. But the inner bark of both those species also has oil of wintergreen in it. And you can do this any time of year. If you find those trees, just do the scratch and sniff. And if you get that wintergreen smell, you know you've got it. And what you can do is just pick a bunch of the twigs and peel the bark off and throw the peeled bark and the peeled twigs in glass jars, room temperature water, and let it sit around for an hour. And you're going to get a nice, strong wintergreen flavored drink. And I'll just mention you can tap any birch tree for sap, including a white birch or gray birch or whatever you might have. And you tap it just like a maple tree, and the sap starts flowing a couple weeks after the maples stop flowing. So southeastern Mass, that would be like the end of March, beginning of April. And when I tapped some trees in my family's land west of Boston a number of years ago, I was getting a gallon of sap in an hour. So the trees really gush. Unfortunately, though, the sap is even waterier than maple sap. You have to boil the heck out of it to get anything. And what you eventually get looks like what's in this bottle here. So it looks and tastes just like molasses, but molasses is so cheap and so easy to get at the stores. My advice would be just go to the store and buy molasses. You're not going to save any time or money making your own molasses from birch sap. Having said that, though, if let's say you were camping or hiking during the time of the year when the birch sap was flowing and you were concerned about the potability of the water supplies at the place where you're hiking, is you could tap the birch trees and get all the pure, clean drinking water you needed that way. All right, so hopefully a lot of you know this plant. This is the black huckleberry, and it is related to blueberries, and I'm sure a lot of people pick these thinking they're blueberries. There's absolutely no harm in them. Black huckleberries tend to be a little waterier and seedier than blueberries, but other than that, they're great. And I'll tell you a trick in case you don't know this, how to tell a black huckleberry apart from a lowbush blueberry, even when the fruit isn't on there. If you take a black huckleberry leaf and pick it off the plant, the sun has to be out for this trick to work, and take that leaf and hold it upside down in the sun, it will sparkle with these little oily dots. Blueberry leaves don't do that. So if you can do that, then you know you got the black huckleberry. All right, and then also is this blue huckleberry, and this is a fun plant to find in southeastern Mass. So this one I tend to find in wetter habitat than the black huckleberry, and these plants get taller. They could be 3 or 4 feet tall. And one nice thing about the blue huckleberry is these fruits often persist on the plants after all the regular huckleberries and blueberries are gone. So I have found these after Labor Day. So if you're cursing yourself because you messed up and you forgot to pick blueberries or huckleberries when they're in season, here's something that's still available after they're gone. All right, so here's my other point about looking for something outside of the time when it's available. Okay, so if this were a live audience, I'd be asking you, what is this plant? And some of you would know, and it's amazing how few people do know, though, even in southeastern Mass, what this plant is. And then I give a big hint. I say, look, here is a boardwalk going over a dune. Does that help you? And then the light bulb goes off and some of you figure out it's beach plums I'm about to talk to you about. This could be the most valuable piece of information I'm giving you the entire show, especially for those of you that are always said, I've heard about beach plums, but I'm never able to find them. Here's the trick. You want to look for them in the spring when the plants are blooming in May, because then they show up much better than when the fruit is ripe. Because when the fruit is ripe, it's this purpley color, which is hard to see at a distance. So it's good to already know where the bushes are, remember where they are, and then go back and get them. And the right time to get them is Labor Day weekend, sometimes a week or two before, sometimes a week or two later, but Labor Day weekend is a reliable time to find beach plums. And the fruit is about as big as a Bing cherry, that's as big as it gets, and they will vary in flavor from bush to bush. Sometimes they're puckering astringent, and other times they're really yummy and just about as good as a cultivated plum you grow yourself or buy at the store. And they do not have to grow by the ocean, by the way. So this photo I took many, many miles away from the ocean, where I saw some bushes blooming in the spring, and I said, boy, those look like beach plums. And I went and checked the spot in early September, and look at all the beach plums I found, just because I had my observation skills turned on. So I propagate these from seed. I've got a bunch from the little pits. I've got a bunch of beach plums growing in my nursery, and I love to plant these out on some of my coastal sites. All right, and yes, there's fun things to do with beach plum. This is usually the first step, is to make the beach plum jam or jelly, and then you can use that jam for making other yummy treats like this rugelach, or also strudel. It's a fun thing to do with beach plums. All right, and there is a yellowy orange form of the beach plums. So this photo I happen to take down in Dennis, but it's possible these are in southeastern Mass too. And these yellowish orangey fruits, I think they taste at least as good as the purple ones. And maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but I swear that these fruits have kind of an apricot-y flavor to them. And I don't know if it's just the color suggesting that to me, or if it actually does. I should be blindfolded sometime and do the test and see if I think that then. All right, well, anyway, so that's beach plums. I hope you find some, and we're just coming into the time to start looking for the right fruit. All right, so while we're at the coast, let's talk about a few edible coastal species. So there's beach peas, which are available in the cooler weather, the late spring and early summer. So now, usually by midsummer, they short it out. But when the colder weather returns in the late summer into the fall, sometimes you get a second crop of them. And it's these tender peas that are the edible parts. So not when they're hard, but when they're very young and immature. You can use these like garden peas. And I will have to say that garden peas are tastier. But if you're not growing garden peas and you're at the beach and you're finding these immature pods of beach peas, I think it's funner to be collecting these than just sitting around in a towel getting skin cancers. So that's the beach peas. Here's a plant called sea rocket. And this is related to horseradish, and it has a similar sharp flavor like horseradish or wasabi. So these leaves have quite a kick to them, especially later in the growing season. So this is an annual species, and it produces seeds and will reseed itself often in the same location. But I've seen some places in southeastern Mass where this plant is not that common. So if you are going to harvest it, I encourage just taking 1 or 2 leaves per plant. That's a totally sustainable way of harvesting the plant. And these leaves are quite strong, so a little goes a long way. So I was paddling a tidal river last weekend, found some sea rocket growing along the shore of the tidal river, and we had brought salmon salad sandwiches with us and layered a few of the sea rocket leaves in with the sandwiches. It was an excellent accompaniment to those sandwiches. All right, so that's the sea rocket. Here's a plant called orac, and you can see what looks like the rack line behind you, the highest point of the high tides, and that's often where you find the orac. So this is a close cousin of the gardenweed lamb's quarters, and you can use this one the same way. And if you cook the leaves, it's very yummy. So once again, I encourage you to show some forbearance and restraint in harvesting this one. So wait till you find a nice large patch, and then pick sparingly from that patch to make sure you're leaving a lot behind, and enjoy it. All right, same thing for this glasswort or pickleweed. So this plant never produces any true leaves. This is all it does. And I'll have to say that this one's probably tastier earlier in the season than now or later in the season, because it gets a kind of a bitter aftertaste to it this time of year. Early in the spring, it's better. And this plant, once again, I encourage you to use forbearance and restraint in harvesting it. So I would just take a modest amount of the tender tips off some of the plants and leave the rest alone. And the tender tips are the tastiest part anyway. And it's called pickleweed because that is a use of this plant that some people have made and do make of it. All right, and there are edible seaweeds. Most seaweeds are edible. The only one I'm aware of that's poisonous is the one that is red and is very filamentous like hair, and that has sulfuric acid in it. But most of the macrophyte, the big leaf seaweeds, are edible, and I'll go through a couple of them. So this is dulse, which looks like a flat maroon hand floating in the water. And this one, seaweeds vary as to what their texture is like and when is the right time to eat this one. So this one is not edible raw just because the texture is like trying to eat a piece of plastic. It's way too tough. But when it dries, it becomes all soft and supple. And And it's delicious just straight into your mouth, just chewing on it, or you can chop it up and add it to other foods that you want to add a nice briny flavor in there, like a frittata or a soup, something like that. And then Irish moss, and Irish moss is mainly used to extract the carrageen or the carrageenan, which is a gelatinous substance that you can use for making this beautiful dessert called a blancmange. And this young woman made this dessert at a wild edibles potluck that I helped organize on Martha's Vineyard a number of years ago. And yes, here is more bleached out Irish moss. And this is probably even better than the fresh stuff to use. And you can often find this washed up on the beach because this stuff can be really salty and briny. And you have to work with it quite a bit to wash the salt out. And most of this is less salty. So I would say that's even better. Okay, now here is a case where the more that this plant is harvested, the better off the environment is, because this is an invasive species called codium, and it has several common names: green fleece, dead man's fingers, oyster thief. And I just taught a class along Narragansett Bay a couple weeks ago and found a bunch of this washed up. And it's edible raw, it's edible cooked. The Koreans make kimchi out of it. And it's all over Martha's Vineyard. And so this is a plant I actually, last time I taught on the vineyard, I suggested that they try to organize a codium cook-off on Martha's Vineyard and have all the chefs start experimenting with this plant and come up with some good recipes for it. Because if they're able to make it really yummy and put it on the menu, the more this plant is picked, the better off the environment is. But this is a big exception to putting edible wild plants on menus, which generally I worry quite a bit about, especially when native species are involved, because I'm worried that it's going to trigger unscrupulous harvesting, commercial scale collecting. But for this species, go right ahead. Oh, okay, so sorry. Roses. So all roses are edible, whatever species it is, wild or cultivated. And the edible parts are the rose petals and the rose hips. So in Southeastern Mass, you're lucky because you have the best species for foraging, and that is the beach rose, Rosa rugosa. And it's the best one because it's tasty and big. So the petals are edible. You can use them for decorating salads or desserts. You can make rose petal jam, rose petal jelly, rose water, which is used in Middle Eastern cooking, is all made from rose petals. And then the rose hips. So here's the Rosa rugosa rose hips. And as you probably know, these can be quite big as like a golf ball or a ping pong ball. And this is when you want to pick them, when they're this color and they're soft. So same color, same color and softness like a tomato. And so that's the right time to get them. And each of these rose hips, if you want to eat it raw, you have to cut it down the center, and then you'll see a bunch of seeds in there with irritating little hairs. Scrape all of that out. You don't want to eat any of that. And then what you have left, the outer part of the fruit, you can eat. And the flavor of a good rose hip is like a cross between an orange, an apple, and a strawberry. They're quite yummy. It's also an extremely concentrated source of vitamin C. So one cupful of rose hips with the seed scraped out of the center could give you as much vitamin C as 12 dozen oranges. So they're really packed. So rose hips you can use for making rose hip tea with fresh or dried hips, rose hip jam, rose hip jelly, rose hip butter, which is like an apple butter. So all that is great. And those are in season right now and will be for the next at least a month or so. All right, so if you've seen sumac plants like this and you've been worried that this was poison sumac, you are wrong. And you can tell just from the fruit. Any sumac with these tight, upright clusters of red berries is not poison sumac. So what does poison sumac fruit look like? It looks like that. Nothing whatsoever in common with the edible sumac. So yes, poison sumac does grow in Southeastern Mass, and it can give you a rash even worse than poison ivy. So it's not a plant to take lightly. But if you're foraging, mainly you're looking for the ripe fruits. And so you wouldn't mess that up with this. Okay, so in Southeastern Mass, it's the staghorn sumac, the smooth sumac, and the winged sumac all have these tight clusters of reddish fruits. And the main thing you do with this is you make a drink from them, and it's quite easy. This is all described in my book, is you just pick the ripe fruit off the plant and just rub it with your finger and make sure you get a nice, strong, pleasing acid flavor, and then you know those berries are ripe and good to use. And then you just throw the berry clusters into a bowl of water and just knead them like you were kneading bread dough. You're rubbing the berries for several minutes, getting the flavor off the berries into the water. And the water will turn this pink or pinkish orange color. Then fish the berries out. You're done with them. Take the liquid and put it through any kind of a filter like this paper towel. And then what goes through, you can drink hot or cold, sweetened or unsweetened. And I drink it cold and sweetened like lemonade. So there's your drink. And the entire time it takes from picking the fruit off the plant and drinking the drink can be as little as a half an hour. All right, so there's wild grapes. They grow all over southeastern Mass, and I hope you've had the fun of in September walking or riding your bike along, and all of a sudden, grapes, grapes, where's that smell coming from? And follow your nose and find the fox grapes on the vine and stuff your face right by the vine, which is a lot of fun because the fox grapes, this is the progenitor of the Concord grape. And they can get very big, more than an inch in diameter, individual fruit, and they vary in flavor, but sometimes they're really sweet and very grapey and very yummy. And you can make stuff from those grapes. So I'm typically filling up baskets with these fox grapes in September. And you see how the leaf is coppery and finely woolly. Sometimes this color is white. That's true with the Vitis labrusca. That's what this species is. And so what you can do with these grapes is process them. Is I'll throw them in a big pot like a lobster pot with some water, simmer them for a while, put everything through a food mill, and the skins and seeds are held back. And then the juice and pulp goes through, and take everything and pour it into a tall container like a pitcher, and it will separate on you. And the top part will be this delicious wild grape juice, which you can drink just plain. And then the bottom part will be this thick puree, which might be too thick to enjoy as a beverage, but that's the raw material for making wild grape jam, jelly, sorbet, and other yummy things like this wild grape cheesecake. All right, now the other species you might encounter, and there is a third species called the summer grape too, which has similar characteristics to both of these. It's kind of intermediate. But this is the riverside grape where, so I've seen this one in the Cape, I'm sure it grows in southeastern Mass too, where these fruits are smaller and not as yummy as the fox grapes. They're kind of musky flavored, but you can still make jam or jelly with them if you wanted to. But these leaves are smooth and green on the underside, and some people that make the stuffed grape leaf recipes prefer this species. So you want to look for the leaves in June is the best time to get them, although later in the summer, if you work really hard, you might find some that are young enough for stuffing, but ideally you want to get it in June or up to mid-July. And then you can make your own stuffed grape leaves. It's kind of thing that you can serve to company. Once again, I look forward to the time we can do that again. And then there you go. You serve that to them, and they'll love it, especially when they find out that they're wild grape leaves that you picked and stuffed yourself. So the last thing I'll say about grape leaves is, and this information still applies now, that if you make pickles and you take a grape leaf, and as far as I know, it doesn't matter what kind, and you put a grape leaf in the jar where those pickles are going, those pickles will come out crisper because that grape leaf was in there, and it's because of the tartaric acid in the grape leaves. All right, so hazelnuts grow in southeastern Mass, and there's two different kinds. There's the common hazelnut where the husk looks like a little head of cabbage, and the beaked hazelnut where the nut develops inside this thing with this strange thing sticking out that looks like a bird beak. So yes, so hazelnuts grow wild, and they're smaller than regular hazelnuts. And I would be misleading you if I said to you, you haven't lived to try the flavor of a wild hazelnut. It has the same flavor as a conventional hazelnut. So you might say to yourself, I'll just go to the store and buy hazelnuts, which is perfectly fine. But I've gathered many hundreds of wild hazelnuts on my own, and I'm going to tell you 2 tricks for how to do that. So first thing is, look for the hazelnuts under power lines. And I don't think it's the electromagnetic radiation. I think it's just all the sun that they get there. And the fact that these power line corridors are often wide, so wide that the squirrels and chipmunks, they're kind of scared to spend a lot of time out there because there's hawks and snakes and foxes and other things that will try to eat them out there. So they can't work the bushes quite as hard as they can when they're in the shade. So that's good. And also, in general, fruit and nut trees produce better in the sun than in the shade. It's like tomatoes in your garden. The more sun they get, the heavier they produce. And the second trick is, don't wait until these husks fall off the ground with the nuts inside them, because you'll never find the nuts. You have to pick the the nuts when they're still attached to the tree. And but you want to pick them as close to ripe as possible. So this is what they look like when the husks have begun to turn brown. And so when is this? It's around the second week of September. And so that's my advice, to go out and get them. And then what I'll do is just throw the slightly immature husks with the nuts inside on a piece of newspaper in my garage, and I'll just ignore them for 2 or 3 weeks. And then the husks will turn brown, and then they separate easily from the nuts. And then you can just use a regular nut cracker to get the nuts open. All right, so acorns are edible, and all oak trees produce acorns, and all acorns are edible. They just vary as to the level of tannic acid in them. So in general, it's the acorns from what's called the soft oak species, like this white oak, or down in southeastern Mass, you've got a lot of the swamp white oak. So those are relatively lower in tannic acid than the oak species with the pointy lobes on the leaves. So I tend to prefer these. Even then, you have to leach the tannic acid out. And this is explained a little bit in my book for your knowing how to do it. All right, so here's my #1 favorite edible wild plant out of everything in this show or that exists in New England, and it's the shagbark hickory. And so this is what the bark looks like. This isn't a seasonal phenomenon. The bark always looks like this. So I'm always paying attention in the landscape where I see these. So for example, I discovered a whole bunch in Bridgewater, just along the town river, just because I was paying attention, looking for the bark. You know, it was like in the spring, and there they were. So yeah, so this one, like another place I've seen them is the road. I can't remember what the road is called if it has a number in it, but you go down Route 24 and you take the turn for the Berkeley-Dighton Bridge. And that road, along that road, has got a bunch of shagbark hickory nuts on it. And so like the hazelnut, you want to look for these trees when they're out in the open, the edge of a road, in the edge of a field, in the middle of the field, and then you'll find a lot of these hickory nuts. You don't have to pick these off the tree. Wait till they hit the ground, but don't wait too long because the squirrels eventually get them. And sometimes just the impact of the nut falling off the tree and hitting the ground bursts this four-parted husk off, and this is what you see inside. And this is what the nuts meats look like inside the shell. And those of you that attempted to get hickory nuts open know it's quite a trick to get these beautiful halves out like this. I'm going to teach you the trick. The trick is align a nut like this, so you're standing it up on its side, and down here, this would be a hard surface like a rock. And right here, you want to hit the nut with a hammer, not hard. You want to hit it just hard enough to send cracks to the shell. And more often than not, the two halves open right up, and that's when you can extract big pieces out like this. Now, I don't want to mislead you. I do have to use a nut pick to get a lot of the meats out, but you do get large pieces out if you open them that way. So here's my maple hickory nut pie. This is a New England version of pecan pie. The recipe's in my book, and virtually everybody I served this to preferred over pecan pie. It's really good. Now, if this had been a live slide program, I would have made one of these cookies for you. So sorry, that's one of the drawbacks of these virtual programs is I can't give you wild edibles to nibble and sip on after my talk. So I apologize for that. So these are yummy cookies made from shagbark hickory nuts. All right, so black walnuts, you can also find these in southeastern Mass. You also do not have to pick these nuts off the tree. Wait till they hit the ground. And then they're going to look like old green tennis balls piled up along the road or in somebody's yard. And the first trick is to get these husks off. And this is an admittedly messy task because these can stain your fingers brown. They're kind of smelly. So I just stomp them in the field to get most of it off there and then hose the rest off with water from my rain barrel on my patio in my backyard. And after you've done that, then you have a bunch of nuts that look like this. And then the next trick is to get these open. These shells are really hard, so you can't use a conventional nut cracker. So you have to use a brick or a rock or a vise. And here's the advice I use. I ordered this from a company in Oklahoma. And so you just push down on this lever, and then you see big pieces can come out this way. And black walnut nut meats they don't taste like our standard store-bought English walnuts. They're very assertive in flavor. But it pairs really well with honey. So black walnut baklava is really good. black walnut honey squares. This is another thing I love to bring on my live talks because people love these and they're very easy to make. All right, so here's groundnut. This plant is one of the most historically important plants in southeastern Mass because this is the plant that enabled the Pilgrims to survive their first harsh winter during the New World in 1620-21. And it's because they ate the tubers. So here are the tubers right here. So they found a cache of tubers that had been in the Native American encampment that had been abandoned several years earlier that they occupied. And that's what helped to supplement the meager remaining food supplies they had from the boat. And I've propagated this plant from these tubers and from the little beans inside the little pods right here. And so far, my favorite way to eat groundnuts, and by the way, these tubers are available year-round, is to just slice them and then fry them in a little vegetable oil, make groundnut chips. They're quite good that way. All right, so if this is a live program, I'd be asking you, what is this plant? And a lot of you would not know, but some of you more astute observers would know this is a cranberry, what a cranberry looks like when it's blooming. And cranberry used to be called a craneberry because of the appearance of the flowers that look like the birds, the cranes. And of course, I had thrown this slide up, you would have known. And yes, in southeastern Mass, you're very fortunate to have an abundance of cranberries. And although some people will differ with me, I think the wild cranberries pretty much the same flavor as the cultivated cranberries. You might make an argument for the cranberries that persist on the plants after a frost or two. You could at least imagine that the cranberries are sweeter than they were earlier in the season. But anyway, there are wild cranberry bogs, and it is fun to find and pick your own wild cranberries, which I enjoy doing. All right, so here is autumn olive. This is another of the invasive species. So this is all over southeastern Mass because you've got a lot of sandy soil. And one of the reasons it's all over southeastern Mass is because the Mass Highway Department and other people, including the agency I used to work for, planted this plant before we knew it was invasive. So now we regret that decision, but that's one of the main reasons why this plant is so common in the landscape now. So it has a wonderful smell in the spring, like sweet pepper bush. There's a close-up of the flowers. That's what the fruit looks like. So it's going to look like this in October, which is why the plant is called autumn olive. So if you've ever called this plant Russian olive is actually a related plant that has a kind of a yellowish, grayish colored fruit. So if the fruit is red, it's actually autumn olive. So I love to make a puree for this fruit that I use to make a fruit leather from that. So now I'm going to tell you how I do that. So there's a close-up of the berries. They have these silvery white speckles on the outside. And so I'll pick the berries, and the picking can be rather fast. If when the berries are fully ripe, they drop at the slightest, just tickling the branches, hundreds have fallen into your basket. So what I do is take the fruit like this, and I just put it in a bowl of water just to pick out any spoiled berries or any twigs or leaves that got in there. And then I take the clean fruit and I put it in a pot, like a lobster pot, with just enough water to keep the fruit from scorching, like an eighth of an inch, a quarter of an inch. I simmer it for a while, and then I put all this simmered fruit through a food mill and turn the crank, and all the seeds are held back, and the juice and the pulp goes through, and I end up with this frothy mauve-colored puree. So you see there's all the seeds left. And then this is what I pour into trays in my food dehydrator, and I let it run overnight. So there it is, putting it in trays in my food dehydrator, and you stack them up like that. You let it run overnight, and then it comes out into this fruit leather, and this has just been chopped up into bite-sized pieces, and this is really yummy. And if I'm lucky, I can find fruit that's sweet enough without having to add any sugar. The last few years, I've had to add like a tablespoon or two of sugar. And yes, autumn olive also makes a delicious wine. This batch of wine was made from fruit that I picked and gave to a vintner, and he paid me back with a case of this wine, which is very nice. So with that, that is my show, and I hope you enjoyed it. And now let me just spend a minute to talk about this book that I kept mentioning. So this book was published by another regional land trust, the Essex County Greenbelt Association. This is the land trust that covers Essex County, so this is Northeast Mass. And Greenbelt allows foraging as a permitted activity. on all their properties that are open to the public. And that's so wonderful. And I'm so grateful for that. I give them all the money from all the proceeds from this book make. So if this were a live program, I'd bring a box of these books and sell them to you on the spot. And then I would send all the money to Greenbelt. And I told them just buy more land with that money and just create more foraging opportunities for everybody. So because this isn't a live program, I can't do that. And ordinarily you could just contact Greenbelt and say, send me a book. But their office is still not really open yet because of the pandemic. And so unless you're willing to drive up to the North Shore, it's a beautiful time to do it. The greenhead season is pretty much gone now. Then you can contact this bookstore called B Street Books, which I keep supplied with books, and they will mail you one. All right, and here is the URL for the webpage to find me on the internet. So all the other programs that I do and the recipes, some of the dishes I mentioned in this show, other articles about foraging and stuff like that is all posted there. So with that, Rachel, I'm happy to take any questions that came in.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I just ate dinner, but your presentation still made me hungry. All right. So the first question was, where can I buy your book? So that has been answered.
All right, good.
Great. The second question from Kay Mowers is, it says, I took a guided walk by Wildlands Trust last year. And the guide said, I'm not sure who this was, by the way, who the guide was that told you this, said that the food grown in Brockton soil is not safe.
Oh, not me.
True for all of these plants. It wasn't you, and it wasn't me, but I know there is some contamination issues with some of the soils in Brockton. I'm not sure if it's the whole city.
Yeah, so I mean, I live in Arlington, Mass, and Arlington, Mass is a relatively built up area. And so most of our vegetables we're growing in raised beds and growing it in soil that we made ourselves. And that's how you can get around that issue if you're concerned about potential contamination. But for some other things, like our blueberry bushes are just in the soil that's around the house. And I don't worry that much about contamination because, let's say, for a heavy metal like lead, it mostly goes to the leaves and lesser to the roots and even lesser to the fruit. So eating fruit in a place that might have a lead problem is not a risky activity.
And I'm pretty sure we have a shagbark, some shagbark trees at the Brockton Audubon Preserve, which is owned by Wildlands.
Oh, great.
Trust,
Yeah, I have seen some.
Yeah.
I think there's like a Brockton golf club that might actually be an adjoining community. And it's a private club, but that road that runs alongside of the golf club has got a lot of shagbark hickory trees on it.
And the Brockton Audubon has been in conservation since the early 1900s, so that's a good sign.
Excellent.
All right, so we have another question. I believe Suzanne asked this when we were, I wrote it down, talking about bayberry.
Yes.
She was wondering if that nomenclature is recent and is it the same as?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So, so this species used to be called Myrica or Myrica pennsylvanica. And I'd say it was about maybe 8 or 9 years ago, it got renamed to Morella caroliniensis. So sometimes I remember to put in the show formerly Myrica pennsylvanica. So I just forgot to do that this time.
Those are all the questions in the chat right now. Does anybody have any more questions? You can feel free to hop off mute and ask a question or type something into the chat.
Hi, Rebecca. I have a question.
Sure, go ahead, Paul.
I have two questions. The first question is, Russ alluded to the fact that on the in Essex, the Conservation Trust there permits foraging on their properties, at least the ones that are open for trail walking. Is that true? Was that true with Wildlands Trust properties?
Yes, absolutely.
Where there are trails.
Absolutely. And like I said, I don't know if you missed the beginning, we're hoping to have another walk, hopefully this fall with Russ in person. We can limit the size of that and, social distance. But yes, you are very welcome to forage on all of our properties. And just like Russ said at the beginning of the program, with native species, just make sure you're taking, we usually say 10% or less, but just, be careful.
Thank you. I have a quick second question, and that is, you've covered plants. What about if you do any foraging of mushrooms? And if so, maybe that's another topic for another time.
Yes. So under our time constraints today, I wasn't able to include mushrooms in the talk because I was afraid that we'd run over. So usually I take a full 90 minutes to cover edible wild plants and mushrooms. So the mushrooms, as they say, you know, it's on the cutting room floor. The mushroom footage didn't make the final product. So yes,
Let's save
I
that-
love
save that
I
for
love to forage for edible mushrooms too, and so I will have some talks, some online talks that do include mushrooms. Like I am doing one for the Wildlands Trust. That's the one that covers Marion, Mass. And that one's going to be in September, and that will include a segment on mushrooms in that show.
Super. Thank you very much.
Maybe we can book you for a mushroom talk as well.
Yeah, well, what I say is I love to talk about edible mushrooms that we encounter while I'm leading a wild edibles walk. But usually it's really hard to do a pure mushroom walk because mushrooms are very finicky and they really want ideal conditions in terms of moisture to come out. So I would say out of the hundreds of wild edibles walks I've done over the years, maybe 3 times have there been so many mushrooms that the tail wagged the dog and we ended up spending more time on mushrooms than plants. All the rest of the times it's been way more times on plants, and sometimes with some significant breaks from mushrooms. But so I do wild edibles walks. If you want just a pure mushroom walk, I can suggest several people that could do that for you.
Super. Thank you very much.
To answer Melanie's question, this presentation will be available on the Wildlands Trust website by the end of the day, Monday. We will have it edited up a little bit, and it will be on our YouTube page as well. Any other questions?
I live in Plymouth near the Wildlands Trust area, and there's a lot of beech trees. Can you talk about the beech nut?
Oh yes, so beech nuts are edible and they have kind of a coconutty flavor, so they're nice. It is a bit of a challenge to find them because typically what people see is they'll see the husks on the ground, which are kind of like the same size and shape as a lemon lozenge, and they split in half, and inside those halves are 2 pyramidal type things,
Right.
which are the shells that enclose the nuts. And usually when you find them, they have a concave shape to them where they look like somebody, sucking their cheeks in. And if you split those open with your fingernail, you find nothing inside. Why is that? It's because the squirrels and chipmunks have already eaten all the good ones, all right?
Okay.
So it's a matter of timing to get out there before. So one trick that works is if, like the storm that just happened, if that storm had happened during the time when the beech nuts were ripe, I'd go out the next day and look under a beech tree, and then you'd probably find some sound nuts. Or another trick that I've heard works, that if you find a tree that's, getting a lot of sun on it, so it's like in the middle of the field, what you can do is you can spread blankets or tarps underneath the tree and then send an agile friend or family member up into the tree to shake the branches, and then the nuts will fall on your tarps. You can collect them that way.
That's why we have kids. Yeah, that's perfect.
All right, great.
And follow-up question on that one. So what's this time of year that they...
Oh, all right. So generally it's September. So
Okay.
I would start checking your trees in September, and depending upon, nuts typically fruit in a bell curve. So you'll see the first few nuts falling, and then it's probably too early. And then, maybe a week or 10 days later, they start falling with much more alacrity. And that would be the time to gather them.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Anybody else?
Well, I am tempted, since technically we're going to 8:30. Is that right, Rachel?
Yes.
Okay, so I've got a surprise for you. I stuck some mushrooms in the end of my show, and so I can cover a little bit of mushrooms. So let me just hold on. Let me share my screen again. Okay, So, and let's go to the mushroom section. Okay, here we go. All right. Oh, you would do that. Don't do that on me. Okay, sorry about this. I'm gonna have to just go through these other slides really quickly to get to the mushroom slides. Hang in there, hang in there, hang in there. Ah, there we go. All right. So, so this is a mushroom that, let me just hide this. Okay. All right. So, you can arrange all the mushroom species there are and cluster to one end of those species that are virtually impossible to confuse with anything poisonous versus those at the other end that even the experts can't tell apart. And so as long as you stay at the safe end of the line and gradually go further out as you gain experience and confidence, that's how to stay out of trouble. Because the problem with mushrooms are there are some deadly poisonous species out there. So the risk of getting seriously poisoned or even dying from eating the wrong kind of mushroom is much greater than for plants. Okay, but there are some safe species, so I'll cover a few of those with you right now. So here is what's called the sulfur shelf mushroom or the chicken mushroom. It's called the chicken mushroom because if you pull the mushroom meat apart, inside looks just like the breast of a chicken. So what you want to look for in this one is this bright pumpkin orange upper layer. This underneath layer here is bright sulfur yellow, like high school chemistry class sulfur yellow. And it's growing in layers directly on wood. So it could be a live tree or a dead tree or a stump or a log, but growing directly on wood. And you'll see underneath the mushroom, there are no gills. Gills are the things that radiate out like the spokes of a wheel underneath the cap of a standard store-bought mushroom. So no gills on this. And so it's this tender part right here, this outer layer of the sulfur shelf mushroom that's going to be the tastiest part. And you can really treat it just like chicken. So you can make sulfur shelf fajitas, sulfur shelf paprikash, sulfur shelf tetrazzini, and comes out great all those ways. So there is a look-alike to this mushroom, but it is a, come on, slideshow. It's an edible look-alike. So this closely related mushroom, this outer part, instead of being yellow, is more of a pinkish white color. And it would be on the underside too. So this species grows at the base of oak trees, and it's at least as tasty as the sulfur shelf. Okay, the French call this mushroom trompettes de la mort, which means trumpets of death, but that's only because the mushroom is black. It's a totally safe mushroom with no poisonous lookalikes. I have found this in Southeastern Mass. It's called the black trumpet chanterelle. And the tricky part about this mushroom is finding the first one because it's black and it's small. These mushrooms are about 2 or 3 inches tall. So the tricky part is finding the first one. And once you find the first one, just stop in your tracks and look around. And chances are you'll see dozens more, sometimes hundreds more. So this year has not been very wet year so far for ground dwelling mushrooms like these chanterelles. So unless the weather pattern changes and it gets a lot wetter, I don't have good hope that we're going to see a lot of these this summer, but hopefully we will. And these mushrooms dry very well. So that's another, if you luck out and find more than you can eat right away, drying them concentrates the flavor. All right, I'm going to skip the puffballs and the boletus mushrooms, go to this one. So this is called a beefsteak mushroom, and I have found a lot of these in Southeastern Mass, mostly on oak trees. And it looks like a piece of meat sticking out of a tree. And you see when you cut into it, it's got marbling just like a piece of meat. So when you squeeze it, red juice comes out just like a piece of meat. So far, my favorite way to cook this mushroom is to brush it with a little teriyaki sauce and grill it on a hibachi like a piece of meat. So this mushroom has absolutely no other lookalikes other than a piece of meat. All right, here's another great one I find in Southeastern Massachusetts. This is called the cauliflower mushroom, and it looks like a big batch of yellowy egg noodles at the base of a pine tree. And this one comes out at the end of August, beginning of September. So that's when to look for it. And I've definitely found this one in Southeastern Massachusetts. That's where this photo was taken in Miles Standish Forest. So yeah, so you see Looks like a big bash of yellowy egg noodles. When you cook it up, it tastes like mushroomy egg noodles. One of my favorite mushrooms. I wish I could tell you I find them every year, but I don't. It's like every other year, maybe even every third year that I find them. But when I do, I get very excited because it's a very tasty mushroom. All right, so I'm going to skip this one. Okay, so this is the most bizarre organism in the show. This is a fungus called corn smut that gets into developing ears of corn, and it swells them up, distends them, and it turns them gray. So I have to admit, this is not the most appetizing looking thing I ever thought about eating, but you can see I'm very excited here because I had heard that this is considered a delicacy in Mexico. In fact, during the days of the Aztecs, that if you were a peasant and you found this growing on your corn, you couldn't even touch it. You'd have to send for an emissary, the emperor, and they would take it off to the royal courts, and only the royalty could eat it. And I thought, all right, it must be good. So brought it home, chopped it up, cooked it up with a little butter, a little onion, and I took one bite and it tasted like mud. And I thought, what is the big deal about this stuff? And then I tried it one more time and I cooked it in a Mexican style with some hot chilies, some poblano peppers, and there's some kind of chemical transformation that happens with the capsaicin in the hot peppers and the corn smut, and that made it taste good. All right, so I've got one last mushroom I'm going to talk about before we're done here, and this is called the hen of the woods mushroom. And these you want to look for at the base, usually of red or black oak trees, sometimes white oak trees. And the older and bigger the tree, the more likely you are to find these. And you see two in the photo here, but a big tree like this, you could find a half a dozen of these gathered around the tree. And you can find these anytime from like the end of August until the middle of October. And so here is another view what they look like. And on a specimen like this, it's been out for a while. So these outer fronds right here are nice and delicate, but the core might be a little bit too woody to be yummy. And this has a very meaty flavor, by the way, like liver, which I appreciate when it's milder. So I tend to gather this mushroom what I would call the chick stage, when it's very young like this, when this mushroom's only about 5 or 6 inches across. And then it's all very tender and mild, and even the core is very tender, so you can use the entire mushroom. And so with that, I will end a little short diversion into mushrooms.
Now, is there a rule for the amount of mushrooms that you can take?
Oh, good question. So like I was saying in the early part of my show, that harvesting nuts and berries is a relatively benign type of foraging because they're the seed dispersal portion of the organism. So what we call a mushroom is the spore dispersal portion of the organism. The main body of the mushroom is the mycelia that's living in the rotting log or in the ground, or the main source of its food. So yes, it's considered to be not harmful to pick fruiting bodies, and then they will grow back when the conditions are right. So having said that, if you're disturbing the substrate, like if you're raking the ground to get every single little baby mushroom, that's altering the habitat, and that could be harmful. And if you did the equivalent of, like, you know, the analogy is like picking apples off an apple tree. You're not hurting the apple tree's continued ability to produce apples by picking apples off an apple tree. But if you were hacking whole branches off that apple tree, it would affect it. So it's the same thing with mushrooms. If you're harvesting them that harshly, yes, that could be a problem. But if you're just picking the fruiting bodies, it's generally not considered to be a problem.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure.
Anybody else want to hop in with a question? Was that Cheryl?
Yeah, I got a quickie question for Russ. How come you included the dark and the trumpet chanterelle? How come you didn't use the sort of regular chanterelle? Do you not find those? That's what
I didn't include it because I don't consider that one to be at the safe end of the line. It has some poisonous lookalikes, which unfortunately people pick and get sick from. So that's why I didn't include it. But yes, those grow in Southeastern Mass, and I happily collect them and talk about them too. But I just left it out of this show because I didn't feel that it was an easy one.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to hop off mute and ask a question? Melanie says, thank you. That was great in the chat. Thank you, Melanie.
All right, so so the deal is that we have tentatively identified a Wildlands Trust property. Is it in Bridgewater? Is that right?
Great River Preserve.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so that's a site I've led several walks on before, so I already know there's some good stuff there. And, you know, provided that we don't go into shutdown mode again, and it's okay to have small gatherings, we hope we'll be able to figure to have a small scale, socially distanced wild edible walk where everybody's in mass and we're all staying apart from each other and all that stuff. But even under those conditions, you know, if it's allowed, we hope to be able to do one of those later on this season.
I have a good feeling about it. I think September is
good.
going to be a good month for
Good.
us. And just so everybody knows as well, if you're interested in things like yoga and meditation, we are offering those outdoor classes right now at the Wildlands Trust headquarters. It's very easy to control people when they're on their mat in a designated area. So that's kind of how we started reintroducing in-person classes. But hopefully we'll be able to do some of those kind of hike type programs soon as well. So thank you all so much. Russ, did you have any closing thoughts?
Let's all pray for rain if we want to find mushrooms this season, because it's been very sparse. I'm lucky because, you know, the plants are much less moisture dependent, so most of them are fine. You know, but the people I know that are particularly interested in mushrooms, they're well, let's say they're not staying local, is they're going to places where it's rained. And I'll just, so as a final tip, I'll tell you that if you go to a weather website called Weather Underground and you search through the map index, they have a map which is called a weekly precipitation map, which they inherited from a former other weather site called Intellicast. And this is a website I consult frequently during mushroom hunting season. And I don't bother to go in the places where it hasn't rained last week. So I'm checking for at least a ½ inch of rain, ideally an inch or more, what you want to see within the past week, to be confident that you're going to run into mushrooms in that spot. So that's my big last tip for the evening.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. That was really great. Thank you all for joining us. Again, the recording will be on the website for the end of the day Monday if you want to rewatch and revisit. And I'll send a follow-up email probably on Monday as well. So thank you so much, Russ.
Okay, thank you all. Good night. Happy foraging.